The border system was quiet in a way that made people nervous. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm, the kind of silence that felt heavy in the air. The United Terran Fleet had been stationed there for weeks, and every day the tension grew a little stronger. Everyone knew something was coming, and everyone hoped they would be wrong. But deep down, they understood the truth. Trouble was already on its way. From orbit, the colony below looked peaceful. It was home to many small species who had once trusted the larger galactic alliance to protect them. Children played in the fields, markets stayed busy, and families tried to live normal lives. But even they could feel the strange stillness in the wind, the sense that something far bigger than them was about to unfold. Inside the Terran command ship, officers moved with controlled urgency. Screens flickered with alerts, and conversations were short and serious. Humans had taken responsibility for coordinating the defense of the system, something they did not complain about even though it placed enormous weight on their shoulders. The Alliance had voted for it, saying humanity was the most adaptable and reliable when things became complicated. For a long time, humans believed everyone stood together. They believed alliances mattered, promises mattered, and unity mattered. But one message changed all of that. The first to leave was a small, insectoid race that lived mostly in forest worlds. Their representative spoke with a shaking voice. Their homeworld was undefended, they claimed. Their fleets were spread too thin. They said they were sorry, but they had to protect their own people first. No one blamed them, at least not out loud. The Terran officers only nodded and wished them safety, though the disappointment in the air was hard to hide. Then the next species left. Then another. And another. What had started as a room filled with dozens of races soon became a room that grew emptier by the hour. Holograms blinked out one by one as delegations disconnected. Their excuses were all different, but the meaning was the same. They were afraid. The invading force was too strong, too brutal, too unpredictable. Many races had already suffered at their hands, and the thought of fighting them again made them abandon reason. They believed staying would mean extinction by the end of the day. What remained of the council was a handful of humans, a few tired engineers, and a silent room that felt much colder than it had in the morning. The Terran commander looked around at the empty seats. They were built for beings of all shapes and sizes, now abandoned like hollow shells. Some still held the faint scent of their previous occupants, a reminder that they had sat together only hours earlier, part of what was supposed to be a united force. The last alien representative disconnected without saying goodbye. The hologram faded slowly, leaving only white light before vanishing. The room fell into a heavy stillness. A junior officer broke the silence. He asked if the invaders truly outmatched them so badly that every race turned away. Another officer answered carefully, saying the invaders were indeed powerful, but not unstoppable. They could be hurt. They could be slowed. They could even be beaten. The real question was not about strength. It was about fear. Fear had made the Alliance crumble faster than any war ever could. Someone else asked if humanity should leave too. After all, the Terran fleet was not large enough to stand alone for long. Their supply lines would weaken, their ships would take damage faster than they could repair, and their soldiers would grow exhausted. No one would be there to relieve them. No one would rescue them if the battle turned against them. The Terran commander did not answer right away. He walked to the wide window that looked out over the colony. Lights glowed across the surface, tiny sparks showing where people lived. Every one of those lights represented families, workers, children, elders. None of them had weapons. None of them could defend themselves. They depended entirely on the ships in orbit. The commander finally spoke, and his voice carried a calm strength that settled the room. He said the other races had made their choices. Fear had taken them. But fear would not take humanity. He reminded them that humanity did not come this far by running from danger. Their history was filled with challenges, and every time they had risen to meet them. Sometimes they had been outnumbered. Sometimes they had been outmatched. But humans were stubborn in a way that made them impossible to break easily. He said abandoning the colony would not just be a failure. It would be a betrayal. Humanity had promised to defend these people. Turning away now would destroy everything they claimed to stand for. It would haunt them for generations. Slowly, officers nodded. A few took deep breaths. Others straightened their uniforms. There was no cheering, no applause, just a steady acceptance of what they had chosen. It was not a glorious decision. It was a weight heavy on every shoulder. But it was the right one. Word spread through the fleet quickly. Mechanics stopped working and looked up when the announcement echoed through their bay. Medics paused mid-conversation. Pilots who were checking their crafts froze, listening with disbelief and then quiet pride. Humanity would stay. Humanity would fight alone. Many felt a quiet fear. Not panic, but the deep fear that comes with knowing the cost of bravery. Still, none of them backed down. They had volunteered for the fleet, not for medals or praise, but because they believed in protecting those who could not protect themselves. That belief mattered now more than ever. Messages began flowing in from the colony below. Families thanked the Terrans for not leaving them. Elders sent their blessings. Children sent short, shaky recordings saying they felt safe because humans were still there. Even soldiers hardened by years of service felt their hearts tighten. Hearing those small voices, one message came from a group of teachers who said they had prepared emergency shelters, but hoped they would never have to use them. They thanked humanity for giving them hope. Another message came from a group of farmers who said they would share whatever food they could once the danger passed. These messages were simple, but every word carried emotion. It strengthened the Terran resolve. Inside the tactical room, officers gathered around a large map. They began planning. They would fortify the orbit. They would prepare defensive lines. They would create escape corridors for civilians if the worst happened. Everything had to be done quickly, cleanly, and with careful coordination. No mistakes could be afforded. Through the window, the stars looked peaceful. But sensors already detected movement far beyond the edge of the system. The invaders were coming. Some officers whispered that the other species might regret leaving. Others said it did not matter. The invaders would likely attack them next. Humanity had seen countless examples of this pattern. Running from danger never stopped danger. It only delayed it. Humans were not perfect. They made errors. They argued. They did foolish things at times. But when it came to protecting others, something inside them always stood tall. Something inside them refused to quit. The commander looked once more at the empty council seats. It hurt to know humanity was alone in that room. But it also created a strange sense of clarity. There was no confusion now. No debates. No disagreements between dozens of species with different fears and different priorities. There was only one decision left. Humanity would face the storm. They would not run. They would not hide. They would carry the weight that everyone else had. Dropped. As the final preparations began, the Terran fleet slowly shifted into position. Engines hummed. Shields strengthened. Weapons charged. The lights across the command ship glowed brighter as power systems aligned for battle readiness. Everyone knew the coming fight would be harder than anything they had faced before. But they also knew something else, something that filled them with a calm, steady courage. If every race had abandoned the colony, then humanity would simply fight in their place. And if they truly had to battle alone, then so be it. They would stand. They would endure. They would hold the line until the very last moment, because someone had to. And humanity had chosen to be that someone. The decision had been made, but the weight of it settled slowly over everyone in the Terran fleet. No one celebrated. No one spoke loudly. Instead, the whole atmosphere shifted, as if every person felt the same invisible pressure pressing on their shoulders. They all understood what it meant to fight alone, yet no one stepped back. They simply accepted it with quiet strength. The command ship felt different that night. The usual background chatter had faded. Officers walked through the corridors with firm steps, but softer expressions. Many of them looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the emotional punch of watching every other ally turn away. They had believed in unity. They had believed the alliance would hold when times became hard. Now that illusion had been broken, and all that remained was reality. In the strategy room, the large central screen showed the star map of the system. Red points blinked on the outer edge where enemy scans had been detected. The invaders had not yet arrived, but they were closing in. It was only a matter of time. Officers stood in a rough circle around the map, discussing plans. Their conversations were calm. Even though the situation was anything but calm, one officer explained they needed to move the support ships closer to the colony to shield civilians if the first enemy wave targeted the planet. Another argued they should keep some ships hidden behind the moon for a surprise counterattack. A third suggested splitting into 2 layers of defense, one close and one far. The debates were serious but respectful, and every voice mattered. That was something unique about humans. They listened, even in fear. The commander entered the room, and people straightened automatically, not out of fear or strict discipline, but out of respect. The commander looked tired, but steady. He studied the map for a moment before speaking. He said they could not spread the fleet too thin. They needed to stay close enough to support each other. If they separated too much, the invaders would break through the lines one by one. They must work as a single shield. Everyone agreed. The plan formed slowly but firmly. While leaders planned, the rest of the fleet moved with quiet determination. In the hangar bays, pilots checked their crafts with sharper focus than ever. They ran their fingers along the metal surfaces, making sure every panel was tight, every line clean. Some whispered to their ships the way people spoke to old friends, as if the machines could hear them and understand. Maybe they could. People had spent years inside those cockpits. Some said the ships felt alive during battle, almost like they responded to the will of the pilot. Mechanics moved quickly between vessels, tightening bolts, checking power lines, replacing anything that looked even slightly worn. Every small detail mattered now. A loose part could be the difference between life and death. The air in the hangar smelled of metal, oil, and faint ozone from charging engines. Sparks flew as welders sealed armor plates. Each burst of light reflected on the workers' faces, showing expressions full of worry and courage mixed together. Medics prepared as well. They checked supplies, sterilized equipment, and set up makeshift triage areas in case the medical bays overflowed. They exchanged quiet glances with each other, knowing what might come. They had trained for emergencies, but the scale of the coming battle made some of them hold their breath. Still, none of them slowed down. Their purpose was clear: save as many lives as possible. In the sleeping quarters, soldiers sat together in small groups. Some sharpened tools. Some cleaned armor. Others stared at the floor, thinking of home. Not everyone talked, but the silence felt shared, not lonely. 2 soldiers sat on the edge of their bunks, both looking at a small holographic image of Earth. The blue planet rotated gently, showing oceans and clouds. One of them said softly that he hoped the people back home never learned how close they had come to losing everything. The other nodded and said that was why they were here, to make sure no threat reached home. Word had reached all corners of the fleet that humanity was standing alone. Some officers worried that this truth might weaken morale, but the opposite happened. Humans were strange in that way. The more impossible the situation became, the stronger their resolve grew. Something inside them refused to break when the world around them fell apart. It was not pride. It was something older, something deep in their history of surviving harsh worlds, disasters, and conflicts. It was a stubborn spark that kept them standing even when it made no sense at all. On the colony below, people watched the sky. Terran ships shone like stars as they moved into defensive formation. Children pointed upward and told each other that the humans would protect them. Some adults cried quietly because they knew the truth. The humans were putting themselves in danger for people who belonged to other species, other cultures, other worlds. That kind of loyalty was rare in the galaxy. Messages continued to pour in. One came from a small group of refugees who had fled from systems already taken by the invaders. They said they had never seen anyone hurt the invaders the way humans had during earlier skirmishes. They said humanity gave them hope just by refusing to retreat. Another message came from a group of miners who lived deep in the colony's mountains. They thanked humanity for staying and said they were ready to hide civilians in the deep tunnels if needed. These messages reached the fleet and lifted spirits more than any speech ever could. Meanwhile, in the communication room, officers monitored transmissions from across the system. They tracked the invaders' approach and calculated how much time they had left. The answer was not comforting. A few days at most. Maybe less. They relayed the information quickly to the commander, who nodded without flinching. Whether they had hours or days did not change the mission. As night cycle approached, the commander walked through the corridors to check on the crew. People straightened and saluted, but he waved it off gently, telling them they should relax and rest when possible. His presence itself calmed many of them. He asked pilots if their ships were ready. He asked mechanics if supplies were holding. He asked medics if they needed more equipment. He asked soldiers if they had eaten. Each small question reminded the crew that their leader saw them as people, not just pieces in a strategy. He stopped at a large window near the end of the hall. The colony glowed below, warm and peaceful. He stood there for a long time. A young officer joined him, hesitating before speaking. The officer asked if humanity truly had a chance. The commander answered honestly. He said the odds were not in their favor. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. Their enemy had no mercy. But then he added something else. He said odds did not decide everything. People did. Choice did. Effort did. Unity did. And humanity had something powerful and unshakable belief that protecting others mattered, even when the reward was nothing more than knowing they had done the right thing. The officer nodded, comforted not by promises of victory, but by the honesty and resolve in the commander's words. Soon after, final preparations began. Defensive shields were tested. Energy reserves were checked. Long-range cannons were aligned. Fighter wings were assigned positions. Ground forces were placed on alert. Civilians were guided to shelters without panic, thanks to calm announcements from the Terran representatives. As the night cycle passed, a faint alarm echoed across the fleet. It was not loud enough to signal battle, but it carried a warning. The invaders were close enough, now that their engines had been detected. Clearly, the invasion was coming. The fleet did not react with fear or chaos. Instead, every person moved with purpose. Pilots ran toward their ships. Officers took positions. Crews activated systems. The commander gave short, precise instructions. The entire ship vibrated softly as engines shifted into combat readiness. No other race was coming to help. No reinforcements would arrive. Humanity was the shield now, and they accepted that. Truth without hesitation. They stood at the edge of the system, ready to face the storm. Knowing the rest of the galaxy might never know the price they were about to pay, But they would stand anyway, because when the universe turned its back, humanity had whispered to itself, with steady and quiet courage, "Then we battle alone." The first alarm came just after dawn cycle. It wasn't the sharp, panicked siren meant for immediate danger, but a steady rising tone that warned everyone the time had finally come. Those who were sleeping woke instantly. Those already awake felt their hearts tighten a little. The invaders had entered the outer edge of the system. The battle that everyone feared and prepared for was now unavoidable. Pilots rushed toward their crafts. Mechanics shouted final checks. Officers hurried through the corridors with quick steps, giving updates as they moved. Every corner of the fleet seemed to shift into motion at once. It was like watching a giant machine come alive, but the heart of it was human will, not metal. When the commander entered the main deck, the crew straightened. No one needed long speeches. No one needed dramatic words. The fear was real, but so was the resolve. The commander gave a single order: prepare the first defensive line. Screens lit up across the room, showing the enemy ships approaching like a swarm of shadows. They moved in tight formations, almost like they breathed together. Their engines glowed a harsh red, and their armor reflected no light at all, making them look like pieces of darkness tearing through space. The first officer at the control table whispered that there were more enemy ships than expected. The number on the screen kept rising as sensors detected new contacts. Some crew members swallowed hard, but kept their eyes focused on the displays. The commander simply said, "Hold the line." That was enough. Terran ships moved forward, forming a curved barrier in front of the colony. Fighters spread out like a net, ready to intercept the first wave. The colony below remained calm, but millions of people watched the sky, hoping the humans above would protect them from whatever horror lay beyond. When the enemy closed the distance, the silence was almost painful. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the invaders fired. The first blast hit the outer shield of a Terran cruiser. The impact shook the entire deck, but the shield held. Terran ships responded immediately, unleashing a bright wave of return fire. Laser beams and energy bursts lit up the darkness like flashes of lightning during a storm. Pilots in the first fighter wing raced forward into the chaos. Their voices came over the comms, steady and focused. They dodged blasts, spun between enemy ships, and returned fire with practiced precision. One pilot shouted that he had disabled an enemy engine. Another said she had cleared a path for the second wing, but the enemy did not slow down. They kept pushing, their numbers heavy and their attack patterns relentless. They showed no fear, no hesitation, no sign of holding back. They came like a force of nature. In the command room, the crew watched the collision of fleets like watching two tides crash into each other. Every hit felt like a punch to the stomach. Every Terran ship damaged felt like a personal loss. But the humans did not fall back. They fought with everything they had. One enemy blast finally broke through and struck a Terran frigate. The ship shook violently. The lights flickered. A section of the hull tore open, and fire burst out into space. The frigate began to drift, losing power fast. The crew inside sent a message saying they were trying to stabilize systems. Before the enemy could finish them off, a group of Terran fighters swept in, creating a shield of their own bodies, blocking shots meant for the damaged ship. It was reckless. It was dangerous, but it saved the frigate. The commander watched, silently, knowing exactly what it cost those pilots to make that choice. Another wave of invaders broke through the first fighter line and headed straight for the colony. Ground forces activated defense turrets, and Terran ships turned sharply to intercept. A small squad of fighters managed to stop the wave just seconds before it reached firing range of the colony's atmosphere. Every minute of battle felt stretched, like time refused to move normally. Sweat formed on brows. Hands shook despite the effort to stay steady. The lights of the command deck flickered from the energy bursts outside. An officer reported casualties, but the commander told her to keep going. They could not afford to slow their decisions. Then came the second enemy wave. It was bigger than the first. Heavier, faster. Terran ships absorbed hit after hit. Shields weakened. Engines overheated. Human voices over the comms grew harsher, more strained. A pilot reported he couldn't hold his position. Another said his controls were failing. A group of enemy ships broke through the upper line, and 3 Terran destroyers moved up to block them, taking direct blasts that shook them to their core. The commander clenched his jaw. He gave orders. With precision, but inside, he felt the pressure tightening. They were holding, but only just. He knew they couldn't survive wave after wave without consequences. On the colony below, civilians huddled in shelters, listening to the faint echo of distant shockwaves. Parents held children close. Elders prayed silently. Farmers and workers, who had never seen a battle this size, whispered thanks every time the Terran fleet pushed the enemy back. Up in the hangar bays, mechanics worked through fire and smoke to repair damaged ships. Some had burns on their arms, some coughed from smoke, but none of them slowed down. They patched hulls, replaced wires, and shoved fighters back into the launch line as fast as possible. One mechanic kept a hand pressed to a bleeding cut while tightening a panel with the other. Someone told him to go to the medics, but he refused, saying he'd go only when the next batch of ships was ready. Meanwhile, in the medical bay, injured pilots and crew arrived one after another. Medics moved swiftly, steady hands working to save each life they could. The medical bay lights turned a soft white, calming the chaos a little, but the faces of the wounded told the truth. This battle was tearing through the fleet. The second wave was reaching its peak when something unexpected happened. The invaders changed formation. Instead of coming in a straight line, they spread wide, like a net aimed at surrounding the Terran fleet. Officers in the command room recognized the tactic immediately. It was meant to cut supply lines, isolate Terran ships, and force them into smaller battles they couldn't win. The commander realized what would happen if the enemy succeeded. A colony would be left exposed. The fleet would be torn apart piece by piece. He made a decision on instinct. He ordered a counterattack that no one expected. Instead of pulling back, he commanded the middle line to push forward straight into the center of the enemy formation. It was risky, nearly reckless, but it was the only way to break the enemy's spreading arc. The middle line obeyed without hesitation. Terran cruisers surged forward, firing continuous beams that tore through the enemy's center ships. Fighters swooped around them, covering weak spots and taking direct hits meant for the cruisers. The shock of the push stalled the enemy's plan. Their formation wavered. For a moment, the Terran fleet gained ground, but the cost was brutal. A Terran destroyer took a critical hit to its engine core. The crew sent a message saying they were losing control. The ship drifted, sparks flying from its hull. Before anyone could help, another enemy blast struck, tearing the ship apart in a burst of light. The room fell silent for a heartbeat, but only a heartbeat. The commander ordered the remaining ships to close the gap. They did. Some ships flew until their shields burned out. Some pilots pushed their engines until alarms screamed. Some gunners fired until their hands shook uncontrollably. Humans fought like people who had nothing left to lose except their promise to protect others. Slowly, painfully, the middle of the enemy fleet cracked. Terran ships pushed through the hole, and for the first time since the battle began, the invaders pulled back to regroup. It wasn't a victory, but it was a moment of breathing, a moment of knowing they could still stand. The commander looked across the deck at his crew. They were exhausted, pale, sweaty, but their eyes held a fire that refused to go out. The enemy had not been defeated. They had merely been slowed. But humanity was still there, still fighting, still refusing to break. And as the crew prepared for the next wave, everyone in the fleet shared the same quiet, fierce thought. As long as a single Terran ship remained standing, the colony would not fall, and humanity would not bow. The second wave had barely ended when the sensors showed something that made the entire command deck go silent. Another enemy formation was approaching, but this one was different. It was bigger, brighter on the scanners, and moved with the kind of coordination that usually only appeared in the final stage of a large-scale assault. The crew watched the screen as the red dots multiplied, forming a thick wall of ships moving steadily toward them. No one needed to say anything. They all understood what this meant. The invaders were preparing to break the Terran fleet completely. The earlier waves had been tests. This one was meant to crush whatever was left standing. The commander breathed slowly, keeping his voice steady as he ordered everyone back into formation. The ships adjusted positions, tightening their lines. Engines hummed, shields flickered with new power, and the crew braced for what felt like the final blow. Pilots sat in their cockpits with shaking hands but clear eyes. Some whispered quick words to themselves, the small kind people say before a tough moment, not prayers, not speeches, just thoughts that helped them focus. Mechanics in the hangar hurried to prepare the last few fighters that were still repairable. Some worked even while their hands trembled from exhaustion. Medics restocked supplies, knowing more injured would be rushed in soon. The fleet was battered. Some ships had hulls dented like crushed metal shells. Others had shields barely holding together. But none of them backed away. Even the weakest ship stayed in formation, ready to protect the colony below. When the enemy finally entered range, they did not fire small shots like before. The first blast was enormous, bright enough to make the viewing screens auto-dim. A Terran cruiser took the hit directly on its side. The shield shattered like glass. The metal underneath melted in moments. The ship spun out of line, alarms screaming through its halls. But instead of exploding, it managed to stabilize enough to drift behind the fleet, barely hanging on. Terran ships responded with heavy fire, but the enemy seemed prepared for it now. Their armor absorbed more hits, and their formation shifted skillfully to avoid the strongest attacks. It felt as though the enemy had learned from the earlier waves and adapted. The commander ordered the fleet to focus their fire on the enemy's left flank. It was the one point where the formation looked a little weaker. Terran ships turned their guns and fired again and again, creating a bright storm of energy. A few of the enemy vessels cracked under the pressure and fell apart, drifting into the void. But many more held firm. The battle became a storm of flashes and smoke trails, ships weaving in and out of danger. Pilots pushed their crafts to the limit. Some dodged enemy shots, so close that the heat scorched the edges of their wings. Others flew straight through explosions, trusting their instincts more than their alarms. The command deck shook as another hit landed on the flagship's shield. Officers stumbled, but quickly regained their balance. One officer reported that the shields were dropping faster than expected. Another said they had only limited power left for the central cannons. The commander listened, nodded, and continued giving calm, sharp instructions. Down below, the colony watched helplessly. Every flash in the sky made parents hold their children closer. Every distant rumble from the atmosphere made people flinch. They knew the Terrans were fighting for them with everything they had, and that truth both comforted and frightened them. Then, in the middle of the storm, a Terran squad made a desperate move that changed the entire battle. A group of damaged fighters, knowing they wouldn't survive another hit, decided to push deeper into the enemy's formation. They moved in a tight arrow formation, engines burning with a glow that signaled they were overloading. They burst through the enemy line, firing nonstop, not caring about the danger. They punched a small hole through the enemy ships, a hole just large enough for the rest of the Terran fleet to take advantage of. The commander saw the opening instantly. He ordered the frontline cruisers to push through. Engines roared as the ships surged forward, their cannons lighting up the gap. The enemy scrambled to close the breach, but the Terrans were already inside. For the first time since the beginning of the battle, the enemy lines started to break apart, but the cost was heavy. 2 cruisers received direct hits before they could pass through the gap. One exploded into a cloud of fire, scattering burning debris across space. The other began to fall apart piece by piece, its engines flickering until they finally went out. The loss hit the fleet hard, but their momentum didn't stop. Terran ships that were still standing forced themselves deeper into the enemy formation. It was messy. It was chaotic. But it worked slowly. On the command deck, screens flashed warnings faster than the crew could read them. The enemy had noticed the Terran breach, and they were reacting aggressively. Another wave of enemy ships turned inward, aiming to trap the Terran fleet from all sides. The commander recognized the danger instantly. If the enemy closed in, the Terrans would be surrounded with no escape route. He ordered a countermaneuver, wide defensive arc meant to keep enemy ships from collapsing the gap too fast. Terran ships moved quickly to adjust, even though many of them were barely holding together. Some sputtered as their engines strained. Others fired with damaged cannons, their shots uneven but still effective. Just when the encirclement seemed inevitable, something unexpected happened. A lone alien ship appeared at the edge of the battlefield. It wasn't large. It wasn't threatening. It hovered uncertainly, as if unsure whether to approach. For a moment, the Terran crew stared in confusion. The commander frowned, wondering if it was a trick. Then another alien ship appeared. Then 10 more then 20. They were different shapes, different sizes, different origins, but they all shared one thing. They were ships from the races who had abandoned the Alliance. They were ships that had once turned their backs, yet now they were returning. The colonists on the planet gasped as new colors appeared in the sky. The command deck erupted in quiet disbelief. No one cheered yet, but something warm flickered in the hearts of the crew. A message came through from one of the returning alien ships. The voice on the other end sounded ashamed, but determined. They said they had watched humanity stand alone against impossible odds. They said they realized they were wrong to run. They said they couldn't hide anymore, while humans risked everything to protect people who weren't even their own. The commander nodded, his expression softening only slightly. He didn't ask for apologies. He didn't waste time on anger. They needed to fight. He sent a simple reply: hold the flank. And they did. The returning ships moved into position on the left and right sides of the Terran fleet. Their firepower joined the humans, creating new walls of light that pushed the enemy back. The invaders, who had grown confident in their advantage, now found themselves squeezed from multiple angles. Terran pilots, seeing the reinforcements, found new strength. Mechanics cheered from the hangars. Medics let out shaky breaths. Officers straightened with renewed energy. The colony below watched the sky fill not just with flames, but with hope. The enemy, realizing their formation had been broken and their trap had failed, began to pull back. Not because they were afraid, but because they were losing ground for the first time. Terran ships pressed forward. Alien allies closed in from the sides. The battlefield that had once looked hopeless now began to shift in humanity's favor. It was not victory yet. It was not peace. But it was a turning point, a moment the entire galaxy would remember. Humanity, who had stood alone when everyone else fled, had inspired the very races who abandoned them to return. And together, side by side, they pushed the invaders back. The storm wasn't over. But for the first time since the battle began, the darkness ahead didn't feel impossible to face. because humanity had proven something no enemy could ever break. They would stand, even when standing seemed impossible, and the galaxy finally understood what that meant. The days that followed felt strange for everyone. The whole galaxy seemed to slow down, as if every world was waiting to see what humanity and the abandoned race would do next. News of their unexpected victory had already spread far beyond their borders. Many believed they were finished when the enemy fleet arrived. Many expected them to fall like all the others before them. Yet somehow they stood, bruised but not broken. And now they carried something heavier than fear, a new sense of confidence that surprised even themselves. The abandoned aliens moved through their rebuilt camp with a different kind of energy. They walked taller. They spoke louder. They worked faster. They were no longer the silent and hopeless group that had watched other species leave them behind. For the first time in years, they felt like the future wasn't empty. And it was because humans had refused to leave their side when everyone else did. The humans felt proud, but they were also tired. Many had not slept properly in days. Still, they kept working. They helped repair damaged buildings and carried heavy materials with the same determination as if the battle were still going on. To them, the mission wasn't finished at all. Winning one fight didn't mean everything was safe. There were still shadows across the galaxy, and they knew more trouble would come eventually. But despite all the worry, something new had formed between the two races. When they spoke, their voices sounded like two groups, finally starting to understand each other. They shared stories, meals, jokes, and small moments of calm. Even the youngest members of the abandoned race approached the humans with curiosity instead of fear. They wanted to see the faces of the people who had stood up for them, even when the whole galaxy turned away. Among the humans, the commander walked through the repaired streets, thinking deeply. He watched the rebuilt walls, the cleaned roads, the hopeful eyes. He remembered how different everything looked before the battle, when the camp felt more like a graveyard than a home. Now it was changing. And the change had come because humans had made a promise and kept it. The commander stopped when he saw a group of alien workers struggling with a heavy metal plate. Without speaking, he walked over, grabbed one end, and lifted it with them. The workers were surprised, but quickly adjusted. Together they carried it to the construction site and gently set it down. One of the workers looked at him and nodded, a silent but powerful thank you. The commander nodded back and walked away, feeling strangely emotional. Sometimes the quiet moments said more than any speech. Meanwhile, the human engineers were making new plans. They studied the enemy technology captured from the battlefield and tried to understand how powerful the opposing force truly was. One engineer leaned over a holoscreen and shook his head. They weren't sending a full invasion, he whispered to another. This was just a test force. The other engineer froze, realizing the same thing. The enemy had only been checking how strong the humans were. This meant something much bigger was coming. The engineers informed the commander, and his expression went still. He didn't panic, but the weight of the news settled on him like a stone. They had survived one strike, but the next one would be far greater. He looked out across the valley, where the abandoned race was slowly rebuilding their lives. He thought of their trust, their hope, how they looked at the humans now, and he knew he couldn't let them face what was coming alone. That night, as the sky turned dark and the stars seemed unusually bright, the humans and the abandoned aliens gathered around a large fire in the center of the camp. It was not a celebration. It was a gathering of people who had survived something they shouldn't have survived. They needed to breathe, talk, and simply exist together for a moment. A young alien stepped forward. His voice trembled at first, but he kept speaking. He shared the story of how his world was the first to be attacked long ago. He described how his people sent messages to every allied species, begging for help. He described the day when every response came back the same one word, repeated across every channel: unavailable. He described how their hope died in that moment. Then he looked at the humans sitting across the fire from him. His voice grew steadier. He pointed at them and said, "You were the only ones who didn't turn away. When we were nothing, you still saw us." His words shook the entire circle. Some of his people wiped their eyes. Even a few humans looked down, moved by the honesty in his voice. Another alien elder with a calm, deep voice stepped forward. She spoke slowly, saying that their people once believed courage was a rare thing. They thought bravery was something only legends possessed. But now they had learned courage lived in ordinary beings too, and the humans had shown them what it truly looked like. When she finished, she bowed her head toward the humans, a gesture of respect that had not been performed in many years. The humans stood up immediately, lowering their heads in return without hesitation. More voices followed, each sharing memories of fear, loss, and silent suffering. Then they shared the moment when the humans arrived, ready to fight even though they had nothing to gain. As the stories continued, the fire crackled softly, as if it were listening too. Eventually, the commander stepped forward. He wasn't used to giving emotional speeches, but he spoke with honesty. He said humans didn't help because they wanted glory or reward. They helped because leaving someone alone in danger felt wrong. He said humanity had made mistakes in the past, but they also learned from them. And when they said, "Then we battle alone," they meant every word. The abandoned race listened with full attention. Some nodded. Some tightened their hands. Some finally felt safe for the first time in years. When the gathering ended, the two groups didn't walk away separately. They walked side by side, like people who now shared the same future. The night wind moved softly through the valley, and the stars above looked less frightening. Over the next weeks, the humans and the abandoned race trained together. They shared techniques, technology, and new ideas. The aliens showed humans how to read their ancient defensive symbols, and humans taught them how to adapt old tools into modern ones. They built stronger shelters, improved their scanners, and expanded their patrols. It wasn't just preparation. It was unity. Every day, they grew more connected. They started planning long-term strategies, not just survival routines. And slowly, an idea began to form among the leaders of both groups. It was simple but powerful. Maybe they could build something bigger than a small shelter on a forgotten world. Maybe they could build a new alliance, one that didn't wait for others to help, one that didn't depend on weak promises, one that stood on real loyalty. The commander and the alien elder met privately to discuss it. The conversation lasted hours. They debated, questioned, worried, and imagined. And finally they decided. Their two races would form their own pact, a bond built not on politics, but on shared struggle. They would protect each other. They would rebuild together. And when the enemy returned, and everyone knew they would not run or hide. They would fight as one. When this decision was announced to the people, the reaction was overwhelming. There were cheers, relieved tears, and proud smiles. They were no longer a forgotten group waiting for rescue. They were a united force preparing for the future with strength and purpose. The humans looked at their new allies and felt something warm inside, a deep belief that they had chosen the right path. And the abandoned race looked at the humans and felt something they hadn't felt in many years. Hope. In that moment. No one felt alone anymore. They stood together under a sky full of stars, knowing the galaxy still held dangers and battles yet to come. But they also knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would face it all side by side. And this time, no one would abandon anyone.